The gravel road into Hendrickson Valley had a way of rattling every bolt in a truck, and on the morning this story begins, it rattled loose more than metal. It rattled loose 40 years of certainty among the farmers who worked that stretch of land in the western part of the county, where the soil turned to dust by the middle of July, and every drop of irrigation water was counted like gold coins in a ledger. The man at the center of this story was Walter Voss, 61 years old, third generation on his family's 240 acres of corn and soybeans. Walter was not a reckless man. He balanced his books twice a month, kept his equipment maintained past the point most men would have traded it in, and had never once, in 30 years of running the farm himself, done anything his neighbors would call strange. So when the pickup trucks started slowing down on the county road that ran along the eastern edge of his property, and the men inside them squinted out at Walter kneeling in his own dirt with a shovel and a crate full of empty glass bottles, word got around fast. By the time Walter had buried his 400th bottle, half the coffee counter at the diner in town had an opinion about it. "He's lost it," said Earl Dunmore, who farmed the section just south of Walter's land and had known him since grade school. "Man's out there burying his savings account in the ground like a dog with a bone." "Bottles don't grow corn," someone else added, and the table laughed the way men laugh when they are more uneasy than amused. Walter heard about the talk, of course. In a farming community that size, everybody hears everything eventually, usually with extra details added on by the time it reaches you. But he kept working. He had a reason for what he was doing, and the reason had come to him not from a fad or a video on the internet, but from something his own grandmother used to tell him when he was young. Let me back up. Walter's grandmother, Anneke, had come over from the Netherlands in the 1950s, part of a wave of Dutch farming families who settled in the American Midwest after the war, bringing with them centuries of hard-won knowledge about managing water in a landscape that never gave you enough of it, or gave you too much all at once. Anneke grew up in a polder village below sea level, in a country where every farmer understood water the way a sailor understands wind. She used to tell Walter, as a boy, about how her own grandfather back in Friesland had used buried clay vessels to keep vegetable plots alive during dry spells, filling them with water and letting the soil drink slowly through the porous clay over days, instead of losing everything to the sun in an afternoon. It is an old idea, older than anyone in that Dutch farming village could trace it back to. The technique is sometimes called olla irrigation, from the Spanish word for a clay pot, and it has independent roots in cultures spanning North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia going back at least 2,000 years. Farmers in arid regions of what is now Iran and Pakistan buried unglazed clay pots filled with water directly next to their crops. Unlike a sprinkler or a surface watering system, which loses much of its output to evaporation and runoff, a buried porous vessel releases water through its walls only when the surrounding soil is dry, because the physics of it work through a simple pressure difference. Wet clay holds water. Dry soil pulls at that water through capillary action. The moment the soil next to the vessel dries out even slightly, it draws water through the clay's pores at a rate matched almost exactly to what the plant roots need. No more and no less. Anneke never had access to clay ollas in Iowa. Clay pots suited to unglazed irrigation weren't sold in any farm supply store in the county. But she had done something clever during hard years in the 1960s, and it was this specific memory that Walter carried with him into his 60s. She had taken old glass bottles, the thick brown and green glass jugs that used to hold vinegar and cider, knocked the bottoms out of some, drilled small weep holes into others, and buried them at an angle near her tomato plants and her squash. It wasn't a perfect substitute for true unglazed clay, since glass doesn't have the same porous structure, but with the right modifications, a buried bottle can still act as a slow-release reservoir, feeding water directly to the root zone below the surface where it counts, instead of sitting on top of the ground where the July sun steals it before the roots ever get a taste. Walter had never tried it himself until 3 years of increasingly unpredictable weather pushed him to it. His region had been hit by what agricultural extension offices were calling a flash drought pattern, a term that had only come into common use over the previous decade. Unlike the slow-building droughts of the past, which farmers could see coming over a season, flash droughts develop over a matter of weeks, sometimes triggered by a stretch of high heat and wind that pulls moisture out of topsoil far faster than normal evaporation models predict. Walter's corn had taken a beating 2 years running, not because the total rainfall for the year had been unusually low, but because it arrived in the wrong pattern. Long, dry stretches broken by intense, fast-draining downpours that ran off the field before the ground could absorb them. He needed a way to hold water in the soil during exactly those stretches, and he needed something that didn't cost him a second mortgage on irrigation equipment he wasn't sure he could depend on long-term. So he thought about his grandmother, and he thought about the crates of empty glass bottles sitting in his machine shed, left over from her preserves and his own home brewing hobby, bottles that would otherwise have gone to the recycling depot 2 towns over. He picked one test row, 60 feet of soybeans on the southeast corner of a field that had historically dried out first every summer. The section with slightly sandier soil and a touch more slope than the rest of the property. Using a post-hole digger, he sank glass bottles at a 45-degree angle every 4 feet along the row, necks poking just above the surface. Bottoms knocked clean off with a glass cutter so water could seep out along the buried length of the bottle. He filled each one from a garden hose, topped them off once a week, and marked the row with stakes so he could track it separately from the rest of the field. He told exactly nobody what he was doing, at first, not because he was ashamed, but because Walter was the kind of man who preferred to let results speak before opinions did. That plan held for about 2 weeks, until Earl Dunmore drove past on his way to check an irrigation pivot and saw Walter out there at dusk with a shovel and a milk crate, and the story took on a life of its own from there. What the men at the diner didn't know, and what Walter didn't bother explaining to them at the time, was the actual soil science sitting quietly underneath his experiment. Soil holds water in what agronomists call field capacity, essentially the maximum amount of moisture the soil can hold against gravity before it drains away. Sandy soils, like the patch on Walter's southeast corner, have a notoriously low field capacity and drain fast, which is exactly why that section always burned first in a dry spell. Traditional watering methods dump water at the surface, where a huge percentage evaporates before it ever reaches root depth, especially in soil with poor structure and low organic matter. A subsurface reservoir changes that equation entirely. It delivers moisture directly at root depth, cuts evaporative loss dramatically, and, because it releases water gradually rather than all at once, it also encourages plant roots to grow deeper and stronger as they seek out that steady, dependable source, rather than staying shallow and lazy, the way roots often do when they're fed by frequent light surface watering. There is a real, documented agricultural comparison here that Walter had actually read about in a university extension bulletin the year before, describing pitcher irrigation trials in dryland regions of India and sub-Saharan Africa, where researchers found that buried porous vessels could cut water usage by 60 to 70% compared to surface irrigation, while maintaining equal or better crop yields because so little of the water was lost to evaporation or runoff. Similar principles have shown up in home gardening circles for years, under names like OLAs or clay pot irrigation. But Walter's version was rougher, cheaper, and built from what he already had lying around. The results came in slower than a movie script would have you believe, because real farming doesn't work in dramatic single moments. It works in small differences that add up over weeks. But by late July, when the rest of the county's fields had gone the color of straw and the topsoil had cracked into the kind of pattern you could lose a marble in, Walter's test row was still holding green. Not lush, not miraculous, but noticeably, measurably better than the untreated rows right next to it. He started doing something simple to track it. Every few days, he'd push a soil probe down at the same depth in the test row and in a control row nearby, and log the moisture reading in a notebook he kept in his truck. It wasn't scientific in the way a university lab would demand, but it was consistent, and consistency is its own kind of proof. Across the driest stretch of that summer, a run of 18 days without meaningful rainfall, the untreated control row hit critical wilting point, the moisture level at which plants can no longer pull water from the soil and begin shutting down, after about 11 days. The bottle-irrigated test row didn't hit that same threshold until day 32. 3 extra weeks. 3 weeks where his soybeans kept photosynthesizing, kept developing pods, kept doing the quiet biological work that turns a decent harvest into a good one, while the rest of the field, and most of the fields around it, had already gone into a defensive, stunted survival mode that would show up as real, countable bushels, lost at the combine come October. When harvest time arrived, the yield difference between Walter's test row and the rest of the field wasn't the kind of number that makes headlines. It was somewhere in the range most careful farmers would recognize as meaningful without being a miracle. The kind of quiet, real-world improvement that convinces a practical man more than any flashy claim ever could. But it was enough. Enough that Walter expanded the method the following spring to a full 10 acres, refining his technique as he went, using a mix of old glass bottles, and eventually some cheap plastic containers, with holes melted through the sides with a soldering iron, buried on a grid pattern he adjusted, based on his own soil moisture readings, rather than any formula out of a book. Word travels differently once results are sitting there in a field for anyone to see. Earl Dunmore, who had laughed the loudest at the diner counter, was the first neighbor to walk out to Walter's property that autumn and ask, without a trace of joking in his voice, how exactly the thing worked. Walter walked him down the test rows, showed him the soil probe readings in his notebook, and told him the same story his grandmother had told him, about a village below sea level in the Netherlands where people learned, generation after generation, that the difference between a good harvest and a ruined one often came down not to how much water you had, but to how well you kept the water you already had from disappearing before it did its job. It is worth pausing here to say something true about both the American Midwest and the Netherlands, the two places that shaped this story. Dutch farmers have spent centuries engineering some of the most sophisticated water management systems in the world, from dikes and polders that hold back the sea, to windmill-driven drainage networks that turn soggy marshland into some of the most productive farmland in Europe. American Midwest farmers, meanwhile, carry their own hard memory of what happens when soil loses its ability to hold water, etched into family history by the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s, when poor soil management combined with drought conditions to strip topsoil away entirely and drive thousands of families off land that had been farmed for generations. Both cultures, in their own ways, understand that water management is not a modern convenience. It is the oldest and most fundamental problem in agriculture, and the answers to it are sometimes simpler, older, and more available than anyone expects. Walter Voss never claimed to have invented anything. He was quick to correct anyone who called his buried bottles a breakthrough. What he had done was remember something and trust it enough to test it quietly, without waiting for permission from the men at the diner counter or from anyone else who might have laughed at him first and asked questions later. These days, if you drive along that same stretch of gravel road in Hendrickson Valley, in the middle of a dry August, you will still see some of the same fields turning early to that dry, defeated shade of tan. And in among them, you will see Walter's rows, a little greener, a little longer holding on, not because of some miracle out of a bottle, but because of an old idea, properly understood, quietly applied, and given the patience to prove itself over one full, difficult season. Sometimes the most valuable thing a farmer can plant isn't a new seed variety or a piece of expensive equipment. Sometimes it's the memory of what the people before us already knew, buried a little deeper than we thought to look, waiting for someone patient enough to dig it back up.